Okay. So hi and welcome everyone. This is the third masterclass within reading, more specifically the second part of how do we establish independent reading. My name is Pernille Ripp. I am coming to you live from my kitchen. We're moving. I know last time I had some Wi-Fi issues and it might have been where I was sitting in my classroom. And so, or not my classroom, in my house. And so I'm trying to make sure that you get the best quality. Sometimes my Wi-Fi, though, doesn't like that I'm presenting because that's just the world we're in. So let me get started. I'm going to share my screen and then we'll kick this off. It'd probably help if I actually hit share my screen. Give me a second. Okay. If you could make sure that you are muted, unless you are asking questions, that would be really fantastic. All right, I believe I am sharing my screen. There we go. All right. Let's kick this off. So I've shown this graph before, but I want to always start within the identity framework, because for me, looking at reading identity is not an add-on. It's the work that we do. Identity is the lens that we use through everything that we do. And so when I'm planning, I'm not doing necessarily separate identity work. It's always through that connection of how does this go back to me and how does this matter to me. And so these are the 6 components that we really use as centering our work and pursuing this question of who am I as a reader. But that also means really just who am I, right? Like I could put in as a reader, as a mathematician, as a writer, like all these roles that kids play and all these skill sets that they're developing. But what it really comes down to is this question of who am I in general? One of the questions that came up from last time that I didn't get a chance to address was just, well, how do we get the adults in our buildings to read? How do I get my teaching colleagues to see the importance of reading books, especially when the world feels really heavy? And also, how do I get back to reading books so I can speak books with my students? And so just like students should be able to answer, like, who are your book people? So should we as the adults in the room. And so some of the ideas that I've seen implemented and work, and I'm sure go ahead and share more ideas in the chat, is all of these things. If you have a book room collection, offer up book clubs centering around those books. I think it's really important that whenever we use a text in our classroom, either for lit circles or book clubs or read aloud, that we have read it before students so that we can plan around it. It also helps that when I'm sitting in my book club conversations and assessing students, that I can actually hear, are they on the right path or not? And so this is also a great way for us to figure out what is in our book rooms or our book collections and what's not, what's missing. Obviously, using book talks at staff meetings or anytime we come together, this can be from the librarian. It can also be from individual teachers. It can be quick picture books that are in our building now, or just books that you have read. This can be professional development books or any type of books. I've seen a lot of the posters in the bathrooms, right? The book recommendations in staff gathering places. We're stuck there, so it's nice to have something to read and to see, and I've seen it for both kids and adults. One of the things that I love about my district, and there are many, I work in Oregon, Wisconsin school district, is that every year alongside our admin team, we get to do an ed camp type PD sessions. And one of the sessions that I have offered for a couple times has been come and look at the new picture books. It's really wonderful because one, teachers finally get the time to travel to other buildings, and also I can cater it towards certain topics. So one of the sessions I did was what's new in kind of social justice and equity picture books. And so teachers came from that all the way K through 12. And then sometimes it's just come and look at the new picture books and see how you might want to use them. Obviously, if you are a teacher and you're able to be in your building with your students, go to the library with your students. I know in elementary, the library was seen, when I taught elementary, our library time was seen as a prep for us, but I would always go with my students and have that conversation with the kids as they were browsing, and also kind of find books for myself and talk to our librarian. We have a once a week communal reading time when we are face to face, and that includes staff. It's not just that students are asked to read or be a part of a book club or listen to a read aloud, it's that staff are as well. This is not an extra time for us to sit and check email, and I think that that's really important. If we need adults who read, we need books. And so we need funding that protects the purchases of books and allows us to get new and relevant books into the hands of readers, and that includes the adults. I'm very lucky that in my district we believe in funding books, but I know that that is not always the case. This also means PD books. When we have PD books, our district pays for them, and that has been really instrumental in a lot of the PD I've taken. Be a leader who reads. Who can you influence through your reading choices? How can you speak books with staff? And then, of course, also get your students to recommend books to their teachers. I love when students get really excited about a book they've just read, and I go say, oh, you should tell that to your science teacher or your PE teacher or whomever, because it's important that students see us all as readers. So there was just a few ideas that you can use to kind of cultivate an adult reading collaboration in your buildings or in your staff. Please feel free to use the chat box to obviously add more ideas of things that you have done in your staff. So today I really want to make sure that I get into independent reading. I know it's weighing heavily on a lot of people's mind, mine included. I am still in the situation that my district has not yet declared how we're starting the year. It will be either hybrid or virtual, and I will make whatever work. But I want us to start thinking about what is it we're missing, because I happen to know that a lot of districts are implementing best practices when it comes to independent reading instruction, and yet what is it that is not happening? Why is it kids can't wait to get on summer vacation and never have to read another book or graduate and become a part of the 27% of adults that don't read a book within a year? And so when I came across this research, it really clicked for me. And I think that we can take away the term adolescent. I really think this goes for any reader, right? That motivation and engagement, as we know, are critical for the development of readers, because we've seen this play out in our instruction. That if students aren't motivated to read, then it doesn't matter kind of what amazing things we come up with in our reading instruction, because it's not being transferred and anchored into their own identity. Sure, they can maybe take the test, or they can sometimes do the work, sometimes they can't, but they're not seeing that deeper connection and deeper benefit from our instruction. And so once again, I stand on the shoulders of giants. This is not Pernille's invented ideas. This is really continuing the work that so many people have done and are still doing ahead of me. I think of all of my mentors, Penny Kittle and Donna Lynn and Nancy Atwell, but also the people that came before all of these incredible people, such as Louise Rosenblatt, a researcher, education researcher, and an educator. And she said, you know, we need two types of reading. And she said this all the way back in 1978. We need, yes, the efferent reading, right? Reading for information. This is your analysis. This is your decoding. This is your phonics. This is your skills of reading, all the components that we use with kids. But we also need to make space for the aesthetic, the reading for pleasure, the love of reading. Because if we're not doing that, we're never going to get kids to invest in the efferent. And yet when I saw this put out this way, kind of into two separate categories, I had that aha moment of going, but when have I planned for that aesthetic? Sure, I might have given them independent reading time and then gotten frustrated when they didn't all of a sudden start to love reading. When am I planning to develop their aesthetic relational experiences within reading? And I think about that a lot, because I spend an awful lot of time talking about the efferent, the skills of reading, right? What are kids going to learn? But I need to make space in my PD, in my planning meetings, and in my classroom for the aesthetic development, because that's where we're going to see kids truly connect with what they're reading. And so for me, when I think about how this works, I need to have separate times to read within our classroom. I need the 20 minutes that I start with of independent reading, which is focused on the aesthetic part of reading, joyful reading. And then later on in class, we're going to go into the efferent part. So when I think about my joyful reading, for me, it means that I am saying you can read anything you want as long as you're reading. And it needs to be something that's going to build your stamina. So that can be graphic novels, that can be picture books, that can be pop-up books, that can be chapter books, that can be listening to audio, etc. You're not doing post-its unless you want to. You're not stopping and jotting. You're not turning and talking. You're not forced into doing reader's response or forced summaries. You don't have to defend your choice of text to me or your choice of format. And the only to do during that joyful aesthetic reading experience that is embedded into our classroom is to read something that matters to you. And I think about this. It is so important that we do this because when else are kids getting this? Our kids who are already developed readers, who have a positive reading identity, they do this on their own. They seek out experiences that are joyful or that matter to them within their own lives. But our kids who are coming to us who see reading as a chore or reading as something that is really negatively impacting their life, they are often not getting these joyful reading experiences. Reading is always something that they're asked to do something with. They're always asked to prove that they've understood, that they know what they've read, that they can do the skills. Imagine if that was the only type of reading that we had in our adult lives. How quickly would we also change our relationship to reading? So I'm not saying don't do these things, because I still do these things with my students, but at what point are we not doing it so that they have a chance to just sit and read? And for some kids, even removing all these things is not enough. Even giving them a classroom and a school collection with incredible text is not enough. And so there's always going to be kids where this is a year-long and sometimes multi-year-long process of simply getting them to reconnect with reading. Because this is important for us to really embrace, is that reading enjoyment has been reported as more important for children's educational success than their family's socioeconomic status. What is it I sit and worry about a lot? Well, how the lives that my kids lead, and not in a negative, biased way, but just thinking about what can't I control? I can't control outside of my classroom. I can hardly control what's happening in my classroom if you really look at it, right? Like we can set up criteria and hope that the things play out the way we want. But as far as like super control, that's not something that we have when we're talking about individual human beings. The only person I can control is myself. But I can certainly create conditions where reading enjoyment becomes the central focus of what we're doing at all times. And that I never lose sight of how is this impacting my students? When I sit and plan this lesson and I sit and plan up these experiences and whatever it is we're doing within reading and within this classroom, how is that going to impact their reading enjoyment and their relationship to reading? And so for me, the big question that is going on in my head, right, is how are we going to establish and support independent reading if we're not there with the kids? And so for all of you who know that you're starting virtually, or maybe you are an online teacher already, and if so, please let us know your ideas. This is my driving question right now, because when I have kids in front of me, it's not easy, but it's a lot easier because I can hand books to kids. I can kid watch. I can have conversations. Now in the time of COVID, that might not happen. I may be starting my year virtually. So then how do I take these structures? So I'm going to take you through my thinking. And remember, this is a journey I'm on. I'm not an expert because I haven't done it yet. I supported my independent readers in the spring, but that was a different case of what we're going into now. So I gave you my schedule before, and I wanted to just show you again where I fit in both aesthetic and efferent reading. So if you look at the 45 minutes, that 10-minute is the aesthetic reading, and then down in work time, the 20 to 25 minutes that was left at the end, that was where they would do the work around reading, efferent reading. Same thing goes in my 90-minute schedule, except the times are just longer. The 20 minutes is now where the independent reading. This is my conferring time. This is their aesthetic reading for the joy of it. And then that 30-minute work time, etc., that is where they're sitting and potentially using the skills that we've been talking about or doing other work with their reading. And so for me, it's really important that while this is not separate things, we can do efferent work while doing aesthetic, and we can do aesthetic work while we're doing efferent work. I think it's important for kids to understand that there's also two separate things going on. And that I want them to feel what it feels like to sit and just read to fall into the pages, read to discover something about themselves, read to be impacted in some way. And so what I'm thinking now with my schedule, if I am virtual, I don't know what that might look like. And so if there's a possibility of a synchronous live morning meeting, then I'm definitely embracing that. And I also thought about, this doesn't mean that that kids have to come to the time that is their designated class period. I would do this throughout the day for different kids, so that the boundaries of our classroom is kind of broken up, because I teach 3 different sections. I would do a separate read aloud video and separate from my teaching point. That's so that I can create a bank of texts that kids can go back to, and also so that they don't have to go through all of my teaching to get to the book or to get to the slides. And that's something I've been working on. Publishers are slowly starting to come out with extended permissions, still following all of their guidelines. This doesn't mean I go and record it and put it up on YouTube for people to see. This means private recordings, and also taking them down once the permission expires, which it does on right now. I know Penguin just came out and said they're giving extended permission until New Year's Eve of 2020. But I want to have a separate video for teaching point and read aloud, also because I worry about how much time otherwise it will take. And then I want them to transfer it into their independent work. What is the book they're currently reading, the presentation they're working on, writing piece, the speaking piece, or whatever. And so there needs to be some sort of community collaboration. I don't know if that's going to be daily, weekly, or whatever that's going to look like, because here's the thing too. I don't know the state that my students are returning to school in. And so I need to make sure that whatever plans I sit and make over the summer are incredibly flexible and can be adapted to fit their needs. So this is, again, Pernille's unfinished ideas. I want us to take a moment, though, and I want to take a sip of my tea and think about, what is it we tell kids? What does a good reader do? So if you'll go ahead and put your answers into the chat box. What do good readers do? So I see lots of things coming in. Yep, stop when they're confused, ask questions, play the movies, visualize, abandon books. Yes, we'll talk about that. Connections, they make time to read every day, they share, they stop and think, they make inferences, right? They reread, they recommend books to others, share books, right? I think about the excitement that comes from having an incredible book. I think that's why I'm on Instagram, just so I can say, you need to read this book as well. They explore different genres, talk about what they're reading, discuss books. Yes, so many things. And for a long time, I would frame my conversation that way in my classroom. What do readers do? And yet I had the realization a couple of years ago that when a kid tells us that they're not a reader, is it because they're looking at our definitions, either written out or spoken, and they can't see themselves in it? Is a child who can't visualize, which I know I've certainly taught students that haven't developed that skill yet, are they automatically concluding that based on our definition of what a reader is, they're not a reader? Or if a child isn't talking about books with their friends or doesn't make time for reading every day, that must mean that they're not a reader. Because I think a lot about the language and the perimeters that we put kids in. And this is personal. Once again, my own middle daughter, Ida, and who I've written about on the blog, came home to us in first grade and said, Mom, I can't read. I'm not smart, because all the smart kids can read. And she said this through tears. This was despite being with an incredible first grade teacher who loved her and gave her incredible opportunities to blossom. Ida had decided that because reading was not clicking for her, that she was no longer smart. And she didn't want to go to school. Despite having a teacher that loved her, despite having friends and a support network, she didn't think she belonged, that she deserved to be at school, because reading was so difficult. To have your 6-year-old sit and cry in your hallway one night like that really is something that makes you think about, what is the language and the experiences that we set up for kids. And then when they can't see themselves in it, how does that impact us? And so I had to start thinking about, well, what is it we assume kind of a child's reading journey is? And even as a parent, right, that kind of the longer they've been reading, the more the joy is going to go up, because the easier it becomes. And yet, I don't know about you, but I think about, I have met kids where it's all over the place, right? It doesn't matter how many years. And even though this graph kind of still keeps going up, maybe that's not even the case, that it doesn't matter where they're at in their journey, that their they may have been reading for a long time, but their joy may be all the way at the basement level, right? Maybe it's this, that joy has never happened despite being a reader, despite being able to do the work. And what's tricky for us is that because this isn't a sequential journey, there's nowhere it says that at 8 years old, you should have this much joy in reading and feel this way as a reader. We don't know where on the journey that we're coming in. And so we might be hitting the highest peak that they're going to have for a long time in their reading life, or the lowest bottom. And so it's really important for me that instead of sitting and assuming and creating fictitious reading journeys for my students, that they start to do the work about what it means to be a reader. Because for me as a parent and as a teacher, one of the biggest aha moments I've had is just that going into a relationship with a reading, that reading is a relationship. And that means that that relationship carries emotions and directly impacts our self-esteem, directly impacts how we see ourselves in kind of the order of society, directly impacts whether we feel safe in our classes and in our schools. And so when we come at reading through a child's emotional health lens, it changes our instruction, because it has to. Because no longer can I only focus on decoding and fluency and analysis and critical thinking. I have to think about the impact of what I'm doing in my independent reading and my reading processes in class, and how that's impacting a child. Because that impact can have lasting repercussions. So we can use reading to kind of build up children, but we can certainly also use it to tear them down. And it's not because Ida, my daughter, at any point was told that she was a bad reader, but she knew it. Because she sat there and she stumbled through words, and the words weren't coming, and her friends were grabbing bigger books, and she quickly realized that she was not progressing in the same pace that other kids were, that she was being grouped a certain way, which of course she was, because that's how she needed to be supported, but that impacted her to think that she was not smart. And so I think about the conversations that we need to invite into our classrooms that we may not have been having. And so this is an actual anchor chart from my classroom. If you've followed my work, you've seen this all before, because this is something that I've been saying for a long time. I didn't mean to have a conversation 8 or 9 years ago about why reading sucks. I was having the lesson about how reading is amazing, how reading is this journey that we're all going on. And yet when I gathered my 5th graders at the time up on the carpet around me, and I kind of started out my spiel, right, about how we were going to go on an amazing reading journey, Jake whispered to Michael, "Reading sucks." I have mom ears. I can hear everything. And in that moment, the litany of words and the pattern of predictable sentences came to the tip of my tongue, right? "Oh, you just haven't met the right book yet." And all of the things that we tell a child when they tell us that reading is not something they like. We have this litany of sentences that we go through without realizing that it fully dismisses that child's journey. I didn't say it that day. I don't know why. It wasn't like I had some big aha moment of like, oh my God, change the way you teach. But in that moment, I was curious. Why? Why would that be his reaction? And I listened to that curiosity and I asked. So tell me more about that. Why does reading suck? And he froze. He was the kid of a teacher. This was like the first week of 5th grade. Now here was his new teacher sitting there hearing that he had whispered this comment to his friend, and what was he going to do? But Michael, sitting next to him, raised his hand and goes, "I hate sitting still." And in that moment, I made a decision. This was a conversation we needed to have. I had never had this conversation because I was scared. If we put this conversation front and center, would it create a negative reading environment? Would I then have to wrestle this idea from children that reading was awful out of their heads? Would I set myself further back? That's not what happened, though. Kids started to raise their hand and then started to blurt out and talk about when reading wasn't something for them. And then we talked about, when does reading work? When is it okay? And what are the things that we can do? I think about this often because this is like the center of what I do. Starting conversations that kids maybe have been invited into and maybe haven't, but giving them the opportunity to let me know who they are and why they think the way they are. And so every year I tell the story of Michael and Jake, and Michael and Jake are both now graduated and out of high school and on to college. And then I ask my students to do the same. I give them Post-its. And I say, write as many reasons as you can. You can see here, this is from the last year. My students decided to call it reading dope and when is reading trash. And some kids think I'm trying to trick them. Do we have to put our names on it, Mrs. Ripp? Well, yeah, but you don't have to. But I always tell them, like, if you don't like reading, I need to know that because you're my favorite kind of students to teach. And they look at me like I'm crazy. And then some kids are like, well, I only have when reading is trash reasons. That's okay. And then we stand up there and then we look at the patterns. And it's the same thing year after year after year. Reading is trash when you don't get to choose your books. Reading is trash when you are forced to do things such as discuss with strangers, write, and do logs. Reading is trash if the teacher hasn't read the book and the book's assigned to us and it's trash. Reading sucks when my mom tells me I have to read because all my friends do it all the time. When you have to annotate or track down specific things more than 5 times in one day in a packet and then summarize what you read so far for a hard literary essay. Oops, sorry about that. Or Post-its, 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 Post-its. Reading is trash when we have to make our parents sign a sheet saying that we read. I think about this. It's the same year after year after year. And what is it that makes reading magical? When I have a really good book to read and I can read it at my own pace. You can just read. When a book makes you feel a really strong emotion, reading is magical when I don't have to read this many pages. Reading is good when I want to. Reading is lit when I'm relaxed in a quiet place and with an awesome book. It is the same pattern. And it's the same thing that we would say as adults, right? Yet we create these constructed reading experiences that have very little to do with how we read as adults. We forget about the flexibility that we crave as adults when we finish a book, about all of the behavior that we hope to have. These are the conversations we need to have with kids, because I can now look at this and go, tell me what you need from me to make reading amazing this year. Because then this leads into students creating their reading rights. What rights do you want to invest into in our classroom? What rights do you want to have as a reader? And so this is ours from last year. The 3 yellow Post-it notes are from my 3 different classes, because then I kind of pulled together this, but they're almost always the same. We want the right to choose, to abandon, to read for the love of it, to talk about your books or not, a quiet, comfortable space, whatever that means for a child, to reread books because we discover something new every time, not do writing every time you read. Read as a social connection and read carefully and slowly. I think about this because this becomes what they hold me accountable to. We know that choice reigns supreme, yet we remove it so quickly, especially as kids get older, or especially as kids fall behind whatever measures we have set to say where they should be in reading. And so how can you have this if you're online? Well, you can do a live or recorded discussion of your own reading identity, your own journey. You could have kids still do a prompt like this, use Padlet to collect Post-its, and then create a Wordle. What do you notice? To come up with patterns. And then have students either journal or record a prompt. Who are you as a reader? Maybe do it on a form. Breakout rooms to have kids discuss what they want as their shared reading rights and then create them together. If I'm hybrid, I can do all the live discussion and Post-its. We can still do the Wordle because it's a little bit harder with gathering and proximity. Who are you as a reader? Journal prompt. Digital breakout rooms to discuss shared reading rights so that kids aren't shouting from 6 feet apart if that's the mandate we're following. And then we can create our shared reading rights live. But I think what's important is if this is fully online, we have to show our own vulnerability. We have to start modeling what it means to be a reader. We have to let kids into that journey of when we don't read and when we do read, and what do we want to do when we're done with a book, and when have we faced bumps in the road and yet come back to reading. And we need to make kids feel safe. So it can't be you must share this many reasons, or your face has to be in it, or your name has to be in it. They have no reason to trust us yet. We have to earn their trust, especially for kids where school has not been a safe place. And so I've been thinking about what's this flow. If I'm starting virtually, okay, what are my criteria? And this is a work in progress. And so the first thing that came to mind is, of course, kids have to have access to books. I cannot ask students to do independent reading if they only have digital books. For my own daughter, digital books don't work. She can't connect with them in the same way as a physical book. So how are we gathering our resources and our teams to make sure that students have physical books in their hands, even if we're fully online? And that's something that I, of course, have been asking my librarian about, who's already on, talking to all the other librarians in the school district, and we're coming up with a plan. We have to start with the reflection on self, and we'll talk more about that. Who am I as a reader? When is reading good? When does it suck? We set authentic goals. I don't know about you, but I used to set all the goals for my students, and then I wondered why they came to me and they said that the goal didn't make sense. So transferring the goal, and if you're working with younger students, then that might look like that you create or co-create goals with them and then start putting them into goal setting. I call it book enticements. How can we get kids excited about different books? Is it book trailers or book talks or some sort of social component? But how can we entice kids back into reading, especially as the world is upside down? Choice needs to reign supreme. I know we are quick to say, well, I need to make sure that these kids are choosing books that work for them. Yes, but we might not know what works for them. If they choose a book that we think might be too hard, how are we going to support them through it? How are we going to scaffold them through? Because remember, this is their independent reading. This isn't the class-sponsored task or text that they're using. This is the book that they're using to have reading joy. How are you going to protect reading time? Because I don't know about you in your district, but my students kept telling me that they were so overwhelmed in the spring with all of the things that they had to do that there was no time to read. So what are we as a team taking off their plate in order to protect and create reading time? We still need community. How are kids sharing books? How are kids abandoning books? How are kids talking about their books if they want to? And so we're centering that in discussion and celebrations of our journeys as reader. And then, of course, we keep coming back to reflection on their growth. So I need all of these components, and this is going to take time. This isn't something that I just sit down and do in the first 2 days of school, and then we're good, and then everybody's independently reading. This is something that I am working on all year. And for some kids, I am working on it until the very last day. How can I get you to reconnect with independent reading and feel like it is worth your time? So I always start with a survey. And I tell kids, and all of these surveys can be found in the Facebook group, on my website. Some of them can also be found in Passionate Readers, my book that talks a lot more about all of this. But we need to start figuring out who they are as readers, and they need to start thinking about it. And so questions that I'm asking this year, and I'm still working on my survey. If this is in class, then it's just a paper survey because I put it in my binder. I like to have that initial survey on paper. Throughout the year, we switch more to forms or digital surveys. But there's a lot of questions I want to know, and so sometimes I break it up because otherwise it gets to be too much. I do some fill in the blank questions to begin with. Reading is fill in the blank. I read best when, etc. And it's always telling to see what kids say that. I read best when I don't read. I don't want to read. So here's some of the questions that I'm planning on using. A couple new ones that I'm adding is, how many books do you have at home that you want to read? Because I have kiddos that maybe are in book floods, book-rich environments, but they're not books that they want to read, or they're books that they've already read. I want to know about their reading life last year, because I want to know, who are my dedicated kids that are reading is amazing. I want to protect that. And who are the kids where it just hasn't clicked yet. Then I want to know about summer and specifically, but this year I'm also thinking about what was their reading life during the shutdown of school? Did they read at all? Or have they really not read a book since March 13th when our school shut down? I want to know about their book shopping. Where do you have access to books? Especially if we're fully online, a lot of kids are losing one of the biggest access points they have to school. If you have not read Colby Sharp and Donna Lynn Miller's book, Game Changers, I would highly recommend you read that because it talks all about access to books. Do you read outside of school? Why or why not? When we go to confer about your reading, and I'll talk more about what we do in our confers, do you want, so again, this depends on the format we're in. Are we chatting? If we're in class, it's probably going to be through a computer chat, just because I can't sit and shout six feet across the room to a kid. That's not very private. Is it a virtual meeting? Is it face-to-face in some capability? Is it out in the hallway where we are shouting at each other? Then I need to know about their emotions attached to reading. This is language straight from students: bad, average, or good reader, slow, average, or fast reader. So many of my students will tell me I am a bad reader because I am slow. We have to reclaim the word slow. I tell my students, do you mean careful? Like you take your time? And some kids are like, yes, I mean careful. And others are like, no, Mrs. Ripp, like I'm so slow, I lose meaning. Okay, well then you're slow and potentially careful. And then we talk about, how can I help you speed up your reading? What are you reading? You know, can I get you graphic novels? Can I get you free verse or novels in verse? Can I get you high action books that will make you or help you work on your pacing? And then of course, what do you want to work on as a reader? A lot of my students coming into 7th graders are like, nothing. I don't know. So this is where we start. You can see here kind of my reading goal journey, and this is just going to be adapted to online if this is what it is, kind of going back to that previous slide. So that initial survey, this is, again, I'm being vulnerable. I am modeling, asking pointed questions. But when I'm modeling, I'm not taking up so much time that the kids are like, oh, this is the Mrs. Ripp show, and she's just talking about herself at all times. But I'm asking pointed questions. And so thinking about what are the most impactful questions that I can ask on that first survey, because I have a whole year to get to know them. Then we go into goal setting, and I'll show you in a moment what that looks like. Once they have set their goal, then we have our initial conference. And again, that's going to look different this year than it has in the past. I want to know why they chose the goal, because you are inevitably going to have a lot of students that choose a goal simply because the teacher told them to, and they have no commitment to that goal, and the goal doesn't make sense. I've had so many kids that are like, wow, I want to read 100 books this year. And I'll say like, well, what'd you read last year? And they're like 2. And I'm like, okay, is that like, tell me more about that. Is that a realistic goal? Maybe they had a huge reading explosion over the summer. Maybe they're just trying to be nice to me because they want to be seen as compliant. It is so important to me that kids set really good goals that they actually care about. And that's a skill in itself to develop. Then they start the work. We check in. Are you working on your goal? And then they reflect. And we do this for sure at the end of every quarter, but I would also say in the beginning of it, like I do more reflection, and then we adjust or proceed. Have you met your goal? Some kids do. Or do we need to adjust your goal because maybe you weren't quite thinking about your life and how this was all going to play out? We introduced the 7th grade reading challenge. This started as more of a quantity challenge, as inspired by the 40 book challenge created by Donna Lynn Miller. However, it's kind of morphed in a way that kids can now do quantity or habit or both. We do expect kids in 7th grade to read at least 25 books. For some, that is a mountain, and for others, that's no big deal. The 25 is based on kids choosing larger books. Now, the 40 books, I just want to point out, is based on research that kids who do really well within reading and track and develop read 35 to 40 books. For me, when I first moved to 7th grade, if I had said 40 books to a lot of my 7th graders within 45 minutes of English, they would have stepped off that ride as quickly as possible. But for me, why we've kept it at 25, even moving into 90 minutes, is that we have recognized that when we did change it to 40, again, it shut down a lot of kids. But here's the thing, it's not even about the quantity. My students have said every year that simply having that larger goal made them kind of step up their reading game. Now, for some kids, this is going to produce a lot of anxiety. Those kids, we are having separate conversations with, and we start to think about goals, and we start to get to know the kids. That's why, for me, a huge goal is that habit goal. All of the books that they read are self-chosen, even within book clubs, etc. They have a lot of choice. Books can always count for more than one. So, for example, if a kid normally reads 150-page books and now are reading 300-page books, that counts for at least 2 books. If the text complexity has gone up, if they're reading in their home language and they're developing their reading skills, if they're trying on new genres, etc., kids can set that a book counts for more than one. This is really important for me because I used to have very hard and fast rules about like, this is what a book counts for. And kids were like, well, this was really hard for me and it took me a long time. And I'd be like, well, page numbers, etc. The students have taught me that really they manage it. Like I had one kid come up and he had read It by Stephen King. I don't have that book in my classroom, although I love Stephen King. And he was like, what does this one count for? It is like 1,300 pages. And I was like, I don't know. What do you think? He's like, I think it's like 11 books. I was like, do it. Yes, 11 books. Because the number is not that important in that kids are just challenging themselves. Of course, audiobooks count as reading too, and so do graphic novels. I have kids that will come up and be like, well, I think this one counts as a half a book. And I'm like, no, it's a book. You can count it as a whole book. There's no punishment or reward for kids. That's really important for kids too. Like this is truly like a self-dedicated journey. and they keep track through reflections and check-ins, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So I wanted to just show a few example reading goals, but honestly, they're all over the place. That first one, start to actually like reading, is a huge goal for a lot of kids. And some of them work on it the entire year. And I share a lot of this stuff, both in Passionate Readers, the book, but also on my website, et cetera. It's a little easier to find it all in Passionate Readers because it's kind of laid out rather than searching through my blog. But, you know, I share a lot. So this is also the kind of the central question, and I have kids reflect on this. And so it is that, who are you as a reader? And this is our quarter one. You can see this is a very simple form. I have them rank it, scale from 1 to 10. How would you rank it? Why? And then who are you as a reader? And so every quarter we come back to this question, and it's a way for me to check in with, like, how is their reading journey going, in case I miss something when I'm having conferring moments with it. So one of my students allowed me to share her work. And so at the beginning of the year, she ranked it at a 6.5, which is pretty high. Typically, my kids rank it at a 5 is the most common number, or lower. And so she said, why'd you rank it this number? Because just last year I found books that I actually like, but it's hard finding good books. That gives me a lot of things that I can work on with her. Who are you as a reader? I'm a slow reader, but I like to have quiet music playing. And if I'm not doing anything, I fidget. That was it. That was all she knew about herself as a reader. A lot of my students, when I say, who are you as a reader, immediately are like, IDK, question mark, question mark, question mark, or they're like, I'm not. And so then I start to like talk about, who am I as a reader? And that gives kids some ideas and some scaffolds for what they can write about. But this allowed me to have a lot of conversations with this child. Tell me more about being slow. Tell me about, you know, this last year, what kind of books do you like? Why is it hard finding good books? Like, there were so many different directions that I could take our conversation after this child had done their initial reflection. And so this also then centers in, we have to give them time, right? We have to invest into time, not just say, oh, here's our independent reading time, but truly make it an integral part of our classroom. And that's going to look a lot different if we're virtual. So kind of going back to, what are we protecting and how are we keeping kids accountable in some way to do some independent reading? I can show you research for days about why independent reading is central to what we do. If you're ever needing research to defend the use of time for independent reading, Donalyn Miller has a fantastic blog post called, I've Got Research, Yes I Do. I've got research, what about you? And if you Google that, all of this research comes up that supports independent reading. But what I see play out, particularly as we get into middle and high school, or those older years with students where it's not, where it's much more specialized within our instruction, we do a lot of things before we do independent reading. We do a lot of mini lessons on reading strategies, worksheets. We write about our reading, like reader's response, vocabulary. We do read alouds and whole class novel studies. We test their reading, but then we turn around and we say we don't have time for independent reading. And so for me, yeah, we can do all of these things, but the very first thing that we need is independent reading. And then we can do the lessons and the work that surrounds it, and the read alouds and the whole class novels and all of those things. But we can't do these things if we're saying, okay, no, there's no time. And so for me, I'm often asked, like, well, how do I know they're reading or not? Because do I assess my independent reading practice? I don't, and I'll explain more what I do with it. But like, these are all components of how I know my students are reading that. This is also why I'm like really trying to wrap my head around starting all virtually, because kid watching is one of my biggest tools to see if they're reading. They also do the reading check-ins. We keep to be read lists. We'll be establishing all of this stuff, whether we are live or virtual. And so I'm constantly keeping an eye on the reading temperature of our classroom. And then for now too, I want to think about, okay, I'm not there live with my kids every day if I'm virtual or if I'm hybrid. So I want to give them some choice and some accountability things that they can do to invest into their reading journey. Because I worry about accountability. Like, I have a hate-love relationship with the word accountability, because yes, we need to be held accountable, but often it is accountability measures that kill the love of reading. I know I used to do reading logs because I thought that that would somehow spur deeper habits. They didn't. Instead, it just gave me more ammunition to punish or celebrate certain kids. It also told me which parents were good liars. I have lied on many reading logs myself, so much so that I now have a form email that I send every year when we get a reading log. And it is not a disparaging email. You can go to my website if you ever need to send an email to your child's district or school to ask for your child to be exempt from reading logs, but it lays out why I don't believe that reading logs work for my children. But for some kids, they might. And so for me, I've been playing around with ideas of like, okay, what is an accountability choice that kids could choose as part of their independent reading journey? And so I will for all kids, they're going to do a weekly check-in survey, because that's just like, how are you doing and what do you need? On that question, I ask them, which book are you currently reading and how's it going? And that just gives me a quick snapshot view into all kids. And if a kid hopefully trusts me enough, and I'm going to have to work for that, to say, I'm not reading, let's talk about that. I will be doing some sort of weekly or bi-weekly conferring. That's always centered around reading identity first, and then it goes into maybe skills or books. Just depends on times. Kids may choose to be a part of discussion groups. Again, I want to go beyond my class grouping. So if they choose this, then they can choose who they're discussing with, and they can talk about how they want to show off their discussion to me. Kids could also choose to do recommendations. So if a kid knows that they're finishing a book every week or 2 weeks, then they can say, hey, this is my accountability to you. I'm going to go in and do a recommendation. Or they can sign up to do a book talk. We'll record them somehow and then share them out with the class. We can also do some sort of data sheet. Some of my students really thrive on gathering data. They get really into how many pages did I read? What books did I read? When did I increase my reading joy? Et cetera. So maybe that's also a choice that they could have. I'm still playing around with it, but I want to have different choices that kids can use to show off their independent reading. But I also want to make space for the kids that aren't there in their journey, where they're like, well, my accountability is going to be nothing because I'm not reading. That accountability is going to probably be a bigger connection with me and really having some conversations about how can we get you reconnected with reading, and also helping them find value in the reading that they're doing, because all kids are reading. It's just whether or not we count it as reading or not. And so for some kids, it might be that they're reading magazine articles, or they're reading, especially for virtual, think about how much reading kids are doing for other classes that outside of English class. And so how can I start the conversation with those particular kids? So again, these are ideas that I'm starting with. So the power of a reading check-in, if I'm live with students, this is during their independent reading time. I hit about 2 or 3 students a day, and I ask them, do you want to come to me or do you want me to come to you? Most kids want to come to me because it's a little, like my desk is kind of in a corner and we can kind of have a conversation. After asking them just about their life, like how was your night last night, or how was your weekend? What's a question that I ask that is from Sarah Ahmed is just like, what's your news? What's in your world? Then we move into what are you working on as a reader? Now, some of my students will be like, nothing. All right, let's pull out your reader's notebook and take a look at what you set as your reading goal. This is, again, where I can see, are kids actually invested into their reading goal, or did they just set it and then forget all about it? And so that's what then leads our conversation. This is more loose, which is good because it means I can adapt to every reader. It's also not based on the book that they're reading. So I don't need to know the book they're reading because we're talking about reading identity. I take very short notes because for me, and I make sure that they can see what I'm writing down. Because none of us want to sit in a meeting where we know somebody's taking notes and we can't see what they're writing down. That's very distracting and can also make us feel unsafe. And so for me, it's much more about documenting, like, what are the big threads of the conversation? And like, what have I learned about this child, and what are potential ideas I have? So right now, this is what my reading conferring sheet looks like. And each kid just has a sheet, it's front to back. You can see that first box is larger because it's my initial one. And so what's their goal? Why? How was their reading last year? What progress have they made? Because typically they've been working on it for a couple of days. And then what's hard about reading? All kids have something that's hard about reading. And then you can kind of see, what are you working on as a reader, progress, next step, and what did I learn about this person today? And I want to say with that next step, I just want to say that sometimes I don't have anything there. Sometimes I don't know what the next step is. And I think I've had to give myself permission for think time. And I'll tell kids that. And sometimes I'll say, what is your next step? Or how can I support you in this journey? And kids often don't know either. And so this is also where I'm thinking about how can I help kids take ownership over their journey and really think about how they need to invest into their own journey. So it's not always, well, the teacher set this goal for me and I'm working on it, but it does not carry over into my own life in any ways. So here's kind of different reading conferences, focuses. Who are they as a reader is a huge one. How does the book they're currently reading impact them? And this was a fantastic blip of a conversation on Twitter between Jessica Lifshitz and Dulce Marie Fletcher, who's incredible. And they were saying, you know, rather than talking about author's purpose, what is the author's impact? And I was just like, I want to bring that into my classroom. How are they challenging themselves? What's their progress? What's their next step? Because sometimes kids don't have an idea what the next step is. Where do I fit into all of this as the reading adult in the room? What are they going to read next? This is a question I ask kids fairly early on in their book, especially my kiddos who don't have a strong positive relationship to reading. Like, I want them book shopping before they get halfway through the book, because otherwise they get to the end of the book and then they spend weeks sometimes finding the next book. So I would rather that they're successfully reading a book while kind of keeping an eye on what they might read next. And again, that comes into their to be read list, which I'm going to be doing virtually with kids as well. And one of the things that we've talked about with our librarians have talked about is, instead of kids just getting one book when they're picking up books, making like book bags of like, hey, you might like these books as well if you like this other book. And then, of course, I can check in on teaching points in these reading conferences as well. There may be like 5 to 6 minutes, and that's about it. Very rarely do I read in front of my students because I have so many other ways of showing my reading life. And so for me, a question that I get asked a lot is, well, how do you grade independent reading? I don't. It's practice. For me, like, I need to treat it as such. And so if I'm asked to grade independent reading, what is it I'm really trying to measure? Because independent reading is not going to probably give me that answer, because what happens over and over and over when we grade independent reading, we are grading a skill that kids are still developing, where kids may have an incredibly negative relationship to reading, where reading is something that makes them feel awful, such as like my own daughter. If I start putting a grade on that, I am once again equating a child's reading journey with their worth. And so for me, you know, when I grade, it's not the independent reading, because I can see growth. Are they actually reading in the work that they do with the text that we use? And so this is like my plea to the world. Please don't grade how many books they've read, how many pages they've read, how quickly they read a book. Once again, we are punishing kids for being careful readers, which is a skill we should be upholding and celebrating. Please don't grade them on how many minutes they spent reading. All kids have different lives. And the thing is, the minute we start attaching minutes to how long they should be reading, I don't know about your kids, but my kids are like, my teacher said 20 minutes, and they set a timer and they are done. And also, like, how many low-level memorization questions they can answer. I once fell into the rabbit hole of taking some accelerated reader tests. And I failed all of the Elephant and Piggy picture book ones because I couldn't remember what Piggy had said. Like, that's not the point of Elephant and Piggy. And so if this is a practice that's happening in your school, I would encourage you to start asking questions and to change your grading practices, because we need to make sure that the assessments we provide actually provide us with the answers we need. If I grade my students' reading practice, then I'm not giving them any hope. And so for me, I need to grade the work that I'm actually having them do with the skills that they are doing. So here's one of my standards. This is probably the central standard of 7th grade English. And as you can see, there's a lot of things unpacking this in the standard. In your in the chat box, what are assessments that could be attached to this standard? So now it's your turn to think while I drink my tea. I love, yes, themes, yes. Discussion, sketch note, all of these things. And so for me too, when I look at this standard, there's so many things that we can do. We can tear apart picture books. We can look at TED Talks. I can have them transfer the work into their independent reading book. But if I really want to know if they got it, I can use a short story where I know the text. I can do book clubs surrounding this. I can use all sorts of media, because this isn't just, I know it says or story elements in a text, but we take that text loosely. There are so many things I can do here. But I know that my students will do a lot better if they do independent reading to practice this. And so I tell students that all the time, that all of the skills I'm teaching them, I don't expect them to go home and pull out their Post-it notes and start sticking them in their book that they're reading before they go to bed. But what they do need to be able to do is to use these skills when they have to. And so like when we do book clubs, which we do twice a year, this is when I'm like, all right, time to show me. Like, put it all together. All that work that we have done, now is your chance to really show it. But to do that, we need to practice it. And so I think about how I frame that, and that is that independent reading is never assessed. It's what they can do with that reading practice after they've had the practice. I mean, I'm terrible at analogies, especially with sports. You know, it's like saying we're not going to go and assess how the basketball players are dribbling during practice. You know, the real assessment comes in the game where they put their skills together and put it together. And so here were some of the ideas that I also had for that standards, right? And so I think for me, and this is the continual work that I do within my own practice and also help other educators with, is just like, if we want reading to take on this larger meaning, to open up new worlds, to invite new thinking, and have them really be impacted by reading and then go out and change the world, then our assessments need to be focused on the practice of that, right? That our assessments, because assessments inevitably tells kids what we value more than anything. And if our assessments simply value pages read or low-level memorization questions or can you summarize this book, then we're telling kids that that's what we value within their reading life. And so I think that this is also really important. And this is also why I tell my students, your independent reading is never going to be graded, but I can tell whether you're growing if you're doing your independent reading. And so I know that a lot of people have said to me, well, but when I attach a grade to it, or when we use a testing program like Accelerated Reader, we see growth. Yes, but we don't see sustainable growth, because the minute that we remove those programs, we have not seen the transfer into an actual reading identity that is more positive. And so there are lots of accountability measures that I can put into place, such as rewards and trinkets and public celebrations of whoever reaches their goals. But it tends to create more long-term damage. And so I want to think about this, because we so often celebrate our high-scoring readers and think that they're motivated readers, but that's not always the case. I have a lot of kids who can test really well, who will not go and actually do reading outside of the classroom. And so we can't be fooled by the data. Real reading is kids finding space for reading that matters to them, that impacts them in a way. That's what we're going for here. And so I want to end on this final thing, and I'll pick it up from here next week. But we have to provide better purposes for reading, because research shows us again and again that that if we attach a reward to reading, we're really just telling kids that there is no value in reading. Reading is so awful that I have to bribe you to do it. And I love so much the study that's quoted on the right here, is that the only exception whenever reading rewards actually work was for the kids that got to get another book or a coupon for a book. That was the only time that they actually saw a long-term significant change. And so for me, this is what I work with, right? And now that we're thinking about potentially being virtual, how am I going to get that intrinsic motivation activated so that kids can make and find space for independent reading in their lives? So this is for me, right, that I have to center all of my reading identity work around this idea of reading for pleasure, because I want my students to read without the threat of a grade or the promise of a reward. And so this is Kayla, same student, 1 quarter into this journey of impacting reading identity and putting it into our teaching. And you can see that she went from 6.5 to 7.5. She now feels like she's improved a little bit. And there's still so many questions that I have, right? She reads sometimes at home. You know, I read about 50 pages a week. It's not as much as I hope, but home is crazy. There were a lot of questions that I had after this, and she's still at this point in her life in our classroom, does not feel like she has book people. How can I establish that? And so I just think it's so important that we continue to have this ongoing reflection and conversation about reading identity and any kind of identity so that we can hone and change our practice. And we can absolutely have this virtually as well. It's just going to be harder when we don't have the tool of proximity to build trust. And so Dr. Rudeem Sims Bishop's Mirrors, Windows and Sliding Glass Doors, and so many other phenomenal work, you know, she talks about how literature transformed human experience. And that for me is so important, that reading becomes a means of self-affirmation. And this is why readers seek mirrors in books, right? But that self-affirmation, I want students to leave 7th grade English feeling like they're readers and that that's a positive part of their identity. So here are the office hours, and the next session will be next Wednesday, same time. I will absolutely take your questions right now, and I am going to stop recording as well.